And let me tell you a little bit about Roger Mola. Make sure I don't drop my thing on the floor. Okay, so this is one of the times where we are so fortunate as a county to be so close to the federal government, not just because of the federal government, but because of the people who work for the Smithsonian and other places downtown, and we get the benefit of their knowledge and their expertise. And Roger Mola is a case in point. He's a retired journalist from the Air and Space Smithsonian magazine, and he's done more than 1,000 published articles on aviation and aerospace, spanning history, technology, business. And in 2002, Roger was honored as Aviation Journalist of the Year in the category of breaking news. I bet that is a tough category to break into. And this was for his coverage of what we are going to learn about today. After the attacks of September 11, all the news people said, oh, this is the first time that the flights were canceled all over the country. Au contraire. And Mr. Mola did the hard research and found out really what happened in the 1960s for Operation Skyshield. So like many of us, Mr. Mola is a adopted Arlingtonian. You've been here since 1983. That pretty much, you're in. But help me welcome Mr. Mola to the stage.
Thank you, Annette. Very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming to the auditorium tonight. And welcome to the Zoom audience as well. I think that the Zoom people are seeing a static photo of me, which is actually taken on a hike from a couple of weeks ago. Because normally there's a camera here that will be on me to reveal how I normally look. But people in the audience can vouch that I did also shower and shave to be here this evening. It was the fall of 2000, and an editor at Air and Space asked me if I was interested to do an article on a story that she knew about, where during the Cold War, all of the airliners in North America were grounded. And I reacted to that, I think, in a similar way to almost any so-called expert inside the Washington Beltway, which is to say, I had never heard of it, and so I think that proves it didn't happen. She said, well, try anyway. And I did. Over the next weeks and months, I found out that it not only did happen, it happened 3 times. And to this day, it's the largest exercise of its kind ever held around the world using live aircraft rather than as a simulation. And the next... We're right with you. It should be. Oh. There's normally where they show the test pattern, I think, in the old TV days.
There we go.
There we go. Okay. Thank you. So I researched and wrote that article in the fall of 2000 and into the spring of 2001. And it was in the Air and Space offices for editing, and it was set to run that fall. And that September, we had an actual attack by air. That day, I went up to the roof of my building and near the Boston Metro, and I saw the burning of the Metro just about 2 miles away. And I went back and I watched the TV reports for what was happening, and I heard about the national grounding that took place. And I realized then that I had the resources in place, the network from the stories that I had just researched and finished, to be uniquely positioned to write this story. So I called up a magazine that where I contributed for several years down here. That's Aviation International News, AIN. And we agreed that my focus would be the shutdown of the national airspace system. And I chronicled that hour by hour for the next week. with hundreds of phone calls and meetings. And I recorded that, and the article is still online, has been for the last 22 years. It's free for the reading if you want to find it. And then I went back to Air and Space Smithsonian, and we agreed that I should rewrite the ending. So in Air and Space, the article is called "This is Only a Test," and that tells the story of the 3 Skyshields and the national groundings, and it finishes with the experience of the actual attack and how that led to the national grounding of the airspace system. And then for Aviation International News, I did the reverse. I chronicled the next week and created a timeline of how the airspace grounding was accomplished, mostly without the plan that we had learned during Skyshield. And I finished that article by saying, by the way, this has happened 3 times before. Along the way, and since then, in the last 22, 23 years, I've met hundreds of experts from the airlines, from the FAA, in the military, who always say, well, I'm an expert and I've never heard of that. I think that proves it didn't happen. So let's have a listen and see if it did. Right? Here's how we're going to spend this evening. We're going to talk about the 3 Skyshields, which are September 10th of 60, October of 61, and that was by far the largest, with more than 6,000 military flights across the continental US. And then the third and final one, Skyshield 3 in September of 62. I'm going to start that with an introduction by video, and that just runs 3 minutes, and that will summarize our topic. From there, I'm going to look at air defense and civil defense in the Cold War that led up to this exercise. I say defend or deter, and that was a question we have not really solved yet, even today. Do we spend most of our resources to defend against an attack, or do we spend our time looking on ways to deter that attack, either militarily or diplomatically? In the 1950s, we hadn't decided, so essentially we did both, and we'll look at both of those aspects. For the civilian defense, when there's an enemy attack or other kind of emergency, should the plan be to shelter or to evacuate? And once again, we haven't really solved that question. Throughout the 1950s, leading up to Skyshield, equal resources were put into both plans, building shelters for the civilian population, but also working up elaborate evacuation plans for Arlington County and for Greater Washington. So we'll look at both of those. I'm going to spend a good deal of time on this section because Skyshield tested for the first time this entire system of defensive operations and equipment on a national scale. Then we'll look at the Skyshield itself and how that was conducted. During Skyshield 2, the Air Force reported that a B-52, the largest aircraft in our fleet at the time, had vanished without a trace in the Atlantic just north of the Bermuda Triangle. And officially, no trace was ever found of that aircraft after 60 years. I believe in our Zoom audience tonight, we have a woman by the name of Rochelle Christ Luna. Her father was a gunner, Helmut Christ, and he was presumed lost on that flight. He's one of the 8 crewmen who were presumed who died on that mission. I ask, 99% effective was the official word from the federal government after the exercise was done. So we'll look at, was it really 99% effective? I hear some giggles. I think that people seem to be jumping ahead of me. So we're going to take a look at a 3-minute video. This is my buddy here. This is in the late 1950s in New York City, and he's watching from a rooftop about 3 blocks from the Empire State Building, which at the time was considered the most important target in the city.
Operation Skyshield was the largest air exercise in history. The first Skyshield occurred on September 10th, 1960. It tested our response to an air attack on New York, Washington, and major cities. Skyshield was repeated in October of 1961 and a third time in September of 1962. All three times, every airliner in North America was grounded. More than 250,000 military personnel took part, but only a handful knew its full scale. Even fewer knew its true results. Every front page ran the story requested by the White House. Then it was forgotten. Skyshield was run by the North American Air Defense Command, NORAD. Hundreds of bombers and fighter jets controlled the skies. The Army raised its missiles. Navy and Coast Guard ships and aircraft spanned 2 oceans. Most airports turned off the lights. Others opened their aircraft for tours. The White House and NORAD reassured the public that its defense was 99% effective. No other reporting was allowed.
Operation Skyshield was called nearly 100% effective by elated officials. At New York's Idlewild Airport, it was open house for visitors, as it was at many other airports. Airlines figure that today's sightseer may be tomorrow's passenger.
The 3 groundings of Skyshield faded from memory. The nationwide groundings in September 2001 were reported as the first in U.S. history.
So in 1958, we formed an organization called NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command. And of course, later that was changed to Aerospace Defense Command, but NORAD has been operating since '58. This logo on the right-hand side of the screen was their artwork at the time to introduce themselves, and it captures their mission with this dark concept art. Again, in the upper right-hand corner, we have Soviet bombers attacking through a net of radars in the far north and in Greenland. Some make it through, and they're intercepted here by long-range bombers of the US and Canada. Others that make it through are intercepted by shorter-range fighters that we have until they may reach the US border on the north. If they cross that into cities, we had a last line of defense, which was the Nike missile in major cities across the US. This was our arsenal at the time. These are the fighters that were meant to intercept the Russian bombers. And they all have designations that start with F for fighter. Nice pointy nose fighters, look pretty cool. We have one snub-nosed one on the right, the F-80. And these are the designations, but people usually went by their nicknames, which were more fun. It said, the aircraft we're looking at here are the Delta Dart, the Delta Dagger, the Skyhawk, the Skyray. On the upper right, we have the Shooting Star. It's one of my favorites. In the right-hand side, the missile between those two aircraft is called the Beaumark, which is one of the fastest missiles ever created, right up until the last few years. It traveled at very high speeds, and that was one of our last hoax to intercept a Soviet bomber attacking the US. These were the main threats from the Soviet Union. And again, they have designations, but we went by the catchy nicknames that have been assigned by NATO and by NORAD. And that would be the bear, the bison, the badger, and the blinder. All threats. This aircraft here, the Tupolev Tu-95, that was the Soviets' answer to our B-52 bomber. That was the largest in their arsenal at the time. This artwork was released actually this month, exactly 60 years ago in 1963, by NORAD and by Air Defense Command. And it shows our entire detection network at the time. We were worried that the Soviets would attack using a strategy they simply called over the top. And that means they would launch from their long range bases at Murmansk, and from their naval base and their air bases at the Kamchatka Peninsula, and they would travel over the wilderness and the ice into the US, and we had a network in place to detect them that spans more than half of the circumference of the Earth to watch for the Soviet attack. That began over here in the Aleutian Islands with radars pointing north, in the Pacific at Midway Island and Hawaii, at Clear, Alaska, and 2 other stations. Across the top of Canada, we had the distant early warning radars, the DEW line, the DEW. In Greenland, where the attack was most likely to come from Murmansk, we had a major station at Thule, Greenland, on the northwest coast. Stations in Iceland, stations in England, which had just opened this month in 1963, and stations in the Azores. I've seen some of these, and they're really quite bleak, desolate stations. I'm hoping to visit the one in the Azores in a few weeks. If the radar at the DEW line didn't detect them, they might go as far as the Pine Tree line, which surrounded the entire border of the continental United States, all across the northern states, East Coast. They're the southern tip of Florida, along the Gulf and the West Coast, watching for attack. And in the mid-50s, we were worried that the DEW and the Pine Tree might not be enough, and so we built what were called gap fillers, the mid-Canada line of radars. There were more than 60 stations in the DEW line alone. And the cost was well over $1 trillion in today's money to build those. Most of those were built by RCA, but we also had Western Electric and IBM. I mentioned England. This was our newest station, and this was released in '63 because that had just opened. And for the first time, we reported threats from space. Prior to that, and during Skyshield, the biggest threat would be manned bombers that had people in them. But from around '63 on, the threat shifted, and we were most worried about missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. And so that were the main missions of the station in England at Fylingdale Moors was to watch for missiles and also to watch space objects. So in '63, they reported space threats for the first time, and they said they started tracking debris in space that was larger than 10 centimeters, which is about 4 inches. And our technology at the time could detect 357 of those in space. Today, there are more than 36,000 objects in space weighing more than 11,000 tons. Of those smaller than 10 centimeters, that is, they're smaller than 4 inches, there are more than 130 million pieces of man-made debris in space. We still have facilities in most of these places. In a lot of cases, they're no longer used for defense, though in the DEW line has been replaced what's now just called the Northern Line, simply. And they have a defensive role, but you don't hear about that too much. There, when the government of Canada talks about them, it's mainly to tout how many jobs and housing they provide to the Inuit people. So let's look at these pieces in more detail. This is the overview. Oh, by the way, beyond the radars, we had aircraft on patrol 24 hours. They would be staggered takeoffs, so they would constantly have something in the air in both the Pacific and the Atlantic. We had radar ships from the Navy called picket ships that were essentially just floating radar stations. In this area here, we had submarines, and also we had Navy blimps watching for the Soviet attack for days at a time. And these are interesting. Most people never heard of them. These objects here that look like big crabs, those are called Texas towers. And they're called that because they look exactly like oil rigs that you might find in the Gulf of Mexico. And we'll take a look at that. The one closest to us that was feeding in Washington area, information largely to Washington area was right here. And it was about 60 miles off the coast of New Jersey. This is one of the radars I mentioned at bleak places. This is at Thule, Greenland. And to get an idea of scale, these buildings here are 2 stories. This area here, these are small vehicles that are 1 story. Each one of these 4 radars is larger than a football field on its size. This area is inaccessible to ships for at least 7 months of the year. Most of the supply is through to an airstrip there, and it's very difficult to land and take off from there. Inside these houses here are 84-foot radar dishes, just to give you a size, an idea how big these things are. So here were the Texas towers. One was off Cape Cod, one was off Long Island, and the other one was off New Jersey. And these were built in the area of the East Coast known as the continental shelf. And that is the relatively shallow part of the ocean before it falls way off on the continental slope to the deep part of the ocean. And the shelf on the east side is quite wide. It's up to 200 miles long. And the depth never goes past around 200 feet. And some are as shallow as only about 100 feet, even 50, 60 miles offshore. And so the military decided, let's put a radar station there, because if we can detect something there that our patrols miss, that'll give us an extra half hour of warning against a Soviet attack. And so these were built. They originally planned 5, but in the end, only 3 of them were built. Number 2, 3, and 4, where they were numbered. This is number 4, closest to us. And here's what they look like. This one was 60 miles out. The others were from 80 to 100 miles out. This one was built in 185-foot depth of water. And it was operated by the Air Force, but all the supply came from the Navy. You see a helicopter landing here. The design had radar dishes inside these protective domes, and they were designed for a crew of up to 70 men to live on year-round. They were very dangerous to supply because of the waves that would hit them constantly and tricky winds. And so in this case, a helicopter could land, but other times a ship would have to come near the base of the legs. And often the Navy ship would unload to a smaller tender boat, and then a crane would lift the entire boat up onto the platform to unload on the Texas Tower platform. This design had never been tried before. And during the engineering studies, they calculated that it could take winds of up to a Category 1 hurricane and waves of up to 35 feet. That was not tested until the fall of 1960, when that area was hit by Hurricane Donna. And it took a terrible pounding. There were 70 men on board, and they were worried that it wouldn't survive. It was swaying and shaking so much And they asked to be evacuated, and the Air Force refused because this station and the others had our most advanced radar technology at the time. And they said, if you abandon it, the Soviets will come in and take that from us. And so they were ordered to stay there throughout Hurricane Donna. And they just managed to squeak through. But it continued to sway from damage that apparently was not unseen from that hurricane. There was damage below the water level. These legs, by the way, were used to store fuel oil, believe it or not. It began to oscillate. The waves would oscillate it, and also these had diesel generators. And when the radar would turn around inside these domes, that would cause the entire structure to resonate at the same frequency as the turning of the radars. And so they started calling this thing Old Shaky. And the Navy and Air Force finally started listening to the men on how dangerous it was, and they reduced the crew to just the bare minimum to operate it. 28 men, 14 were just there for repair, and the other 14 were operating the station. And they hung on until mid-January 1961, and a relatively mild storm came along. Again, the shaking got terrible. They begged to be evacuated, and the Air Force said, no, the Soviets will capture it. Finally, toward the end of the first day of storms, they said, all right, we'll come. But then it was too windy for the helicopters to come evacuate them. That night, January 15th of 61, it just toppled over into the sea, and all 28 men were drowned. And today, because it's in relatively shallow waters, I mean, by ocean standards, it's still a dive site. It's on the chart. And if you're an advanced scuba diver, you can go to visit it. Say it's about 60 miles off the coast of New Jersey. So just beyond that, we had these aircraft, and these were Navy aircraft built on the frame of an airliner that used to be called the Lockheed Constellation. And passengers loved that because they were so elegant. They had the triple tail, they were very smooth. These were converted with special radars. Most of them were based in Newfoundland. And they would fly patrols of 10 to 12 hours, with 13 men on board. And they would stagger, so we'd have one of these in the Atlantic at all times, 24 hours all year round, watching for Soviet. And they would feed information in to the Texas towers to relay to the mainland, and also to the picket ships from the Navy that were operating essentially just as floating Navy, radar platforms. They had a fun nickname as well. Since they were based on the Lockheed Constellation, they were called Warning Stars. So, a little further out, the Navy figured we might have a threat from the Soviets that was concentrated for some reason. So we could send out one of these blimps to stay in one spot over the North Atlantic for several days at a time. These were non-rigid ships. That meant that their shape only existed because of the pressure of the helium inside. They had about 1.5 million feet of cubic of helium in it. On top is an actual photo of what these look like. On the bottom is a cross-section to show you how large these things were. This is a 40-foot diameter radar inside the envelope of the blimp. Underneath is a gondola that is 83 feet long, and it was 2 stories, and it could hold up to 26 men very comfortably. They had bunk beds in 2 bunk rooms on the top level, and a galley and a lounge area, and all the first level was navigation and for tactical control. All of this information was fed inland to centers that we built in these enormous concrete blockhouses. We built 23 of these across the US. Each of these blockhouses was 4 stories tall, and they had concrete walls that are 18 inches thick to help offset the possible nuclear attack. The long-range radars and the towers, the ships, the warning stars would all feed into these blockhouses. The closest one to us was in New Jersey. And in turn, they would scramble our fighter jets to intercept or ordered the Army to fire our missiles to intercept the bombers. Inside these centers were these consoles with our best computer technology as of 1960. This was the SAGE system. SAGE meant semi-automatic ground environment. And at the time, that was the largest computer ever built in physical size. Doesn't mean it was powerful, but each computer was a half an acre in size and weighed 250 tons. It ran on vacuum tubes. They had 49,000 vacuum tubes. And of course, this laptop computer at the podium here weighs maybe 5 pounds, and it's thousands of times faster and more capable than that system. What this man is doing with a gun in his hand, that was an early form of what we use today. Today, we use a mouse and a cursor to point at things or highlight things on the screen. In that era, they used a light gun. So he points at something on the screen, squeezes the trigger, and there's a photodiode inside the console that reads that, and they could mark the track of an aircraft on the screen with the light gun. What you can't see in this photo, just underneath his elbow, it's hard to believe now, but every console had something that was essential at the time. Built in, per the contract from the Air Force, they had an ashtray and a cigarette lighter. So if the Soviet bombers somehow got past the blimps and the radars and the ships and the subs, they might approach a city. We had in place the Ground Observer Corps, and I think that you've already had a talk on that for the society. At its peak, there were more than 800,000 people who volunteered for that work. And their job was to stand on rooftops or the roofs of their houses or in the highest point of a city to watch for an aircraft. The bottom line is, if the first time that you see an enemy aircraft is over the city, you don't have many options. So a lot of this, especially toward the end of the 50s, was just for morale, because by definition, these people were volunteers who had shown themselves eager to be part of national service, and so they kept them going. But on 1958, when they began to open some of the SAGE computer centers, they put them on reserve, and then the next year, they deactivated the entire Ground Observer Corps. So they overlapped between the human observers and the computer system by a year, and NORAD. If this guy watching the Empire State Building saw an enemy aircraft, his job would be to get on the telephone after checking the wall chart to see if it was a dangerous aircraft. He'd phone what were called filter centers, and the filter centers would determine if that aircraft was supposed to be over that city. And say, oh, no, that's actually just an airline flight. Or yes, we need to know what that is. But as I said, if you only see it when it's a few blocks from the Empire State Building, you don't have much that you can do. Now, we take it for granted today that the tallest building in the city may be a likely target, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is it's usually at the most dense part of the city, and usually it's a prestigious economic target for an enemy to hit. But at the time, there was a reason that actually surpassed those. The tallest building in any given city in the US was usually where they had the AM radio broadcast. And our technology at the time relied on, in the simplest form, on capturing the signal in the range of an AM radio broadcast. And so the highest building in any town was usually the most likely target for a Soviet attack. So it still might get past all those other defenses. So in all of our major cities, we had the Army install the Nike missile. And I have an example here that happens to show Chicago. But this is typical of all our major cities in the US. Chicago alone had 22 centers surrounding the downtown, all along the lakefront. And the idea was not only to act as an actual defense, but to be visible to the Soviets in their reconnaissance photos, so the Soviets knew that all our cities were defended, and to show the taxpayers that we were trying to keep them safe. And so they would have regular drills right out in the open, very noisy, very showy, in Chicago along the way. This is right along the lakefront, right near a beach, all the time. So they'd drill and they'd raise these and they'd show the local population that the missile batteries were ready to go. And of course, we had them all over Washington as well, in Great Falls, which is now a national park, and in Herndon. Here's another example in San Francisco had more than a dozen sites as well. And of course, at the Presidio, but also on Angel Island, which has since been made into a national park. These are Nike missiles ready to go. This is in 1961, all pointed, expecting an attack. And of course, today we still use missile defense as the last hope for an enemy attack by air. The philosophy is different. They're not announced, they're not visible, but they're easy to find. They're right there on the satellite maps and other images. This one, for example, is a block from the White House. It's on the roof of the new executive office building. Here it is circled in the satellite view, and here's what they look like. This series contains they vary from 8 to 16 missiles. It's just called the Avenger Army missile. And there are plenty of other spots that I'll let you find those on your own. I don't get into much trouble. So how do we tell the civilians what is going on? Starting in the early 1950s, we began a campaign at movie theaters, in schools, and posters, and in town halls, posters and advertising campaigns to remind civilians that scary things are coming and to prepare. There was an organization called Alert America that partnered with major advertising firms in New York City and used techniques that had been perfected for consumer advertising, but they rechanneled it to scare the American population to prepare for a nuclear attack. This one on the left is an example that civilians were enemy target number one, and a reminder that civilians can be bombed. And this headline turned out to be quite prescient. 70 out of 100 enemy bombers can get right through our defenses, despite the $1 trillion we had just spent. So they took this show on the road starting in the early 1950s. We had the Alert America convoy that was carried by these tractor trailers, and they'd set up and they'd take over a school or a movie theater, and they'd have shows, and people would come in and see how to respond in case of a nuclear attack. And they'd show the equipment, the sanitation supplies, and the basic fallout shelters to get people prepared and keep them scared. This is typical of the warning you might get to the general population at the time. In case the government didn't tell us that an attack was coming, this says if you see the bright flash, just to fall down and get down. These drills were held several times a year in most schools. We'll talk a little bit more about what was done in Arlington in just a short way. This is a typical poster that was distributed to schools at the time to inform people what the air raid alert siren would sound like. If you heard this siren and recognized it, you were supposed to then go to your radio for further instructions or go directly to a shelter. Do you think that you'd recognize an air raid siren today? You think so? Okay. When I was growing up in Hicksville, New York, in the 60s, they would test the one at my school every day at noon, right at noon, so you wouldn't mistake it for an actual attack. And of course, the poster has the requisite mushroom cloud on the bottom, and just to really hammer home the point. So the system that the federal government devised was the CONELRAD network. CONELRAD for the communications network for use during electromagnetic radiation. In other words, turn on the radio during a nuclear attack. The idea was you could use a CONELRAD radio, which only got emergency signals, and you turn that on once you heard the siren. Or you could put these nifty stickers on your car radio at 640 on the dial or 1240 on the dial. And so once you heard that attack by siren, or it was announced on one of the stations you're listening to, you should immediately turn your AM dial to 640 or 1240. Now, I mentioned that at the time, the Soviet bombers would home on their targets, home meaning find their position, using signals that were largely in the spectrum of the AM radio. And so AM radio stations were a really weak spot for us. The way CONELRAD tried to overcome that is they set up a network of radio stations that would only transmit for a few seconds at a time. So a bomber couldn't really lock in. And they'd get several radio stations in an area to collaborate. And so the signal would just bounce from this station in the suburb to this other suburb to this one downtown. And so the listener would hear what sounded continuous was actually coming from anywhere from 3 to 5 radio stations and changing every few seconds. That make sense? Mm-hmm. And of course, Arlington County, Virginia, we couldn't miss out on the fun, and we joined that network. The Arlington CONELRAD station was WEAM. Their headquarters was right near what's now the courthouse building on 16th Street in the radio building. But they broadcast from the highest point in Arlington, which is off Williamsburg Boulevard on what's called Miners Hill. And a little bit further into the Cold War, they announced plans that they were going to be fully ready for a Soviet attack. They were going to build a station fully underground that also tapped into a well that was on that Miners Hill. Don't know how far they got from it. It's hard to find those records, but their plan was to have 30 days supply of food and be able to keep transmitting on the CONELRAD network for Arlington in case the Soviets struck us. But you may not have access to a radio, and so we tested any number of bizarre other ways to get around. This is a test just south of Philadelphia, where a guy is flying around using a megaphone telling people to get to a shelter. We also had station wagons that were equipped on the roof with this enormous speakerphones. And they looked like an old hearse, but they had a speaker on top that looked like it was out of a cartoon. And they would go through the seats announcing emergency instructions. They equipped a lot of school buses to be roving communication centers. And I saw one of these, and it's just amazing. They would pull into the city in practice tests, and technicians would connect it to the local telephone network, and you go onto the school bus converted, and they actually had dial-up payphones that you could use during the emergency on the school bus. The realization began to come along that we're not sure if we can get the word out quickly enough for people to get to the right place. So the message started to become clearer each year throughout the 50s that if we want to survive, we need to build fallout shelters. And this is about the time that we started using the phrase fallout shelters. Throughout the World War II period, these sections were called bomb shelters because they actually protected you from the blast and from the fire. But once the larger weapons were perfected, we realized that there were no shelters that a civilian could build to protect you from an atomic blast. And so they just were designed to protect you from the fallout that settled in the days after a blast. So the terminology switched. So this is typical of a type of exhibit that traveled the country, and this was actually downtown at the forerunner of what we now call FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management. This was at the OCDM, the Office of Civilian Defense Mobilization, and it showed a typical family shelter. This was 5 people in an 8x10 cinder block carve-out space with bunk beds, kitchen, and of course, their Conelrad radio, supplies, food, basic cooking materials. And the federal government spent a great deal of resources to get information on how to build these shelters in your own community, your own house. This is typical of the supplies that were provided to most of the official shelters, not for houses, but for official. On the left here, this is typical. These box contains 24 pounds of biscuits with 89 biscuits per pound. And these biscuits were designed to be edible for at least 7 years. On the right, we have the standard SK4 sanitation kit. And I mean, here's some gasps here. That was intended for up to 50 people for their toilet needs for a week. So you disassemble it, you take out this toilet top to go on top of the cardboard barrel and line it with the plastic. And we had siphons. I don't even want to think about how that was used. Toilet paper, 80 cups, hand wipes, and some other sanitary needs. And this was designed to take care of potty needs for a group of 50 for a week. And the government printing office, the GPO, printed these by the tens of millions. These were book covers. And I gotta say, I'm really jealous because my mom made me build my own book covers out of paper bags. I didn't get one of these, but these were distributed from around 1957 to 62 by the tens of millions. And they remind kids how to identify the air raid alert, what is the symbol for a fallout shelter, what the emergency supplies look out. These are sanitation kits being brought in, the signals, and the list that the kids needed to memorize on the book cover. Did anyone have one of these? I wish I did. They're pretty cool. So here is a photo released by the GPO of a small part of 25 million fallout brochures that they printed. The GPO commissioned a study to see if they were being distributed. And they set it up as though it was a contest among the suburbs around Washington. The Clarendon post office, the main post office, was given 12,500 of these to then share with the 11 post offices that were then in Arlington. And Arlington was beating all the other suburbs because the citizens picked up 10,000 of those. We only had 2,500 left over. The GPO had a press release, ran in all the local papers in around 1962 that said, well, those are going pretty well, and we have the money in our line item. We have to spend that money, and we're going to print another 10 million, and they did. This guy, he's going to see if these are. This is fallout protection, and I have an example of that later on. And they tried a national billboard campaign as well. This is right by the Space Needle in Seattle. And the local governments would always stress you need to know how to get to your local shelter if you didn't have one at your house. So how did Arlington fit into this? We had a planning commission for Northern Virginia, And this was our shelter allocation. And this is from a wall map that's quite big. It's about 7 by 7 feet in size. And this is just one section. Arlington County Board adopted this plan in September of 1959. And the overall aim was to have 203 shelters in Arlington County. And at the time, they were meant to hold as many as 60,000, which that year would have been about a third of the permanent population of Arlington County, meaning not counting the people who come in who work just for the day. And you see it lists shelters in the J.C. Penney that used to be at the Boston Mall, and all the local schools, and most of the government buildings, bowling alleys, shopping centers, anything that met the criteria to survive the initial blast, they thought, and protection against fallout. The thinking at the time is that if you had a standard 2-level house or building, that alone would help you escape 90% of the radiation. I'm not sure how they came up with that, but they said if you had a shelter built into the earth with at least 3 feet of dirt over you and a good filter and a good tight door, that would eliminate almost 100% of the radiation from an atomic blast. That was the claim anyway. The report, the analysis came out in '62, just as Skyshield was ending, said that Arlington was quite good in identifying these shelters, that it had come close to to having 203, but they had marked almost none of them. So the only people who knew about them were in the county government. And they had stocked almost none of them. So they had none of the supplies we saw earlier. We're good at studying. The action is a little bit different, right? And you still see these quite often in the real estate section. Some of these that were identified. If you look at real estate listings for Arlington, these show up once in a while. This is actually on North Trenton Street in Arlington, and they have a backyard shelter by the federal guidelines to have 3 feet of dirt over the shelter. And in the real estate listing, you're advertising it as a mother-in-law suite. So this one on the bottom is in the Westover neighborhood. And there are 3 communities in Arlington built by a company called Mace Properties, and Westover is one of them. And those were considered in the reports of the time as being one of the better examples of a good ad hoc shelter. When the Mace houses were advertised, including this one here, and which is right behind the Italian deli store in Westover area, a 6-room version sold for $4,800. And their slogan was skyscraper construction. And that meant they used new methods of corrugated steel and reinforced concrete like they would in a skyscraper. And that ended up being a very good basic fallout shelter. One of the better, larger shelters was at the Lion Village Apartments, which is on the corner of Kirkwood and Lee Highway. They had a basement shelter for the entire community, fully stocked with beds and food and toilet supplies. Right, right in this neighborhood, which there's an area called Country Club Hills. That's pretty close to here, right? There's a Tudor-style house that a couple years ago won an award called Design Arlington, because they took their fallout shelter and they converted it into a wine cellar that holds 1,000 bottles. Does anyone here have a fallout shelter? Looks like a no. Maybe someone in our Zoom audience will speak up. So this is a fun article from the time. A guy in Montgomery County, he called the building inspector and said, is it okay if, when he has his shelter built, if the workers come in during the day dressed like businessmen, they do the work at night and they leave in the morning so my neighbors don't know it's being built? And the building inspector said, well, that's fine. That doesn't violate any of our codes. But for whatever reason, the building inspector then said, you know, I'm going to rat out this guy. And the building inspector then called up the local paper. And the newspaper said, well, this is news. Let's get the neighbors to turn on each other in Montgomery County. And they printed this article that said someone in your neighborhood is building a shelter. Essentially, go get them. So, Annette, if you were building a shelter, would you, how would you react? Would you follow this kind of same? Well, there were a court ruling in DC at the time that had the effect of inviting people for a free-for-all, because they said essentially that if there's a shelter and it's locked, you have a right to occupy that shelter. So just like the movies you see about the apocalypse, where people who didn't plan ahead are trying to break into the shelter, the DC government was trying to actually encourage that with some of their rulings. So it's understandable that the Montgomery County guy did that. We had an incident actually at the time, interesting. There was a business just outside of Arlington on South Washington, about 3 blocks from the intersection of Route 29 and Route 7. Today, there's a motorcycle store there called Coleman Power Sports. That lot used to be the Family Fallout Shelter Company. And they had display models on their lot. And one night, a 10-year-old lived the next block over, crawled into one because they didn't have the lid on it, and he fell 11 feet to the concrete floor. And they had to take him to Arlington Hospital Center, and he just had bruises, luckily. They were controversial for that reason. But Family Fallout Shelters was one of the biggest makers, and they were just outside of Arlington at the time. So the local governments were falling behind on their plans to let everyone build a fallout shelter. So the DC government tried to lobby their overseers in the federal government to get an income tax deduction for building a shelter. It didn't fly in DC, but many hundreds of jurisdictions around the US took that idea and ran with it. We have several jurisdictions in Virginia. One of the better known ones is just outside of Richmond in a community called Hopewell. And you can take your fallout shelter, bomb shelter, and if it meets the guidelines from the federal government, you can deduct it as though it's a home office. Almost all the suburbs of New York City have had this kind of tax break in effect now for 60 or more years, and has paid for their shelter many, many times over. They've gotten 60 years of tax break. It has to be used exclusively as a shelter, just like a home office. And the standard would be 8 by 10 feet, though it could be larger. The Arlington version of the Northern Virginia Sun said, well, we're not building enough despite these incentives. So if not cash incentive, how about sex appeal? So I read this several times, and I thought she might be making a joke, but no, she's quite serious. So she suggested that Arlington area have a contest for a queen of the fallout shelter, and that they hire a pretty young model wearing a mink, but carrying a Geiger counter. They'll hold a recipe contest for meals that you could make without appliances in the fallout shelter, and a contest to name the girl you'd most like to spend your fallout with. Now, she wrote it, not me. I'm just reporting here. Right? So the word began to trickle out, and pressure on media to adopt. The main message began coming out starting mid-50s. And I mentioned early on in the introduction, there's a philosophy: when an emergency happens, do we shelter or do we evacuate? And the federal government started to say around mid-50s, well, we can't survive an actual atomic blast, we need to evacuate. And so this map and these reportings started happening around 1955. And by 1960, it was almost exclusively an evacuation plan rather than a fallout shelter plan. In these scenarios, the OCDM, the civil defense people, They said that you need to imagine a circle around the Washington Monument, the main target here, of 20 miles, and say that within that first 10 miles, zero survivability. Beyond that, there would be a chance, and that's where you can have evacuation plans in place. In September of '59, the Arlington County Board, and they met on a plan based on this 20-mile circle, and they adopted it. So that was the official position. They acknowledged that within 10 miles of the monument, there was no one surviving. Today, we have the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they still use the 20-mile standard. So when they identify resources around Washington, it's always that same 20-mile circle. They called it, here it is, the Washington Warning Area Evacuation Zone. This is the Arlington version. You can't see here, it's cut off on the bottom. This is only for Arlington County and Falls Church. A handy brochure, and you can't argue with this message. When the bomb goes off, don't be there. I gotta say that's good advice. And this brochure folded out and tells you how to find an ad hoc shelter or go to one. So we would test these every year, sometimes several times a year throughout the 1950s before Skyshield. They say Skyshield was the first national exercise other than this one that we have on the screen now. This was the biggest one. It turned in 1955. It was just simply called Operation Alert. And this photo on the left-hand side shows people streaming out of the Pentagon, and they were timed from the moment the sirens sounded from their desk till they got to the evacuation area, which in some cases was their car. In other cases, they would stream across Route 110. In other cases, they stream to the river and just wait and be counted. And they were timed on how long it took to evacuate. It involved 15,000 workers in our area. The Arlington County government cleared out, as well as the local county governments. We had 1,200 of those government workers, and they went to our assembly point for the area, which is the Fairfax County Government Garage. They suggested that everyone should be involved, and so they say housewives should pack a lunch, pick a picnic area, and take the kids there and picnic for 2 hours to pretend it's an atomic attack. There were advertisements throughout the papers in that area for women, mothers looking for others to share essentially an evacuation club to help each other pack lunches to have ready and to meet and to take all the kids together to an evacuation spot. This is about a year or two after that, starting to get toward the late 50s. Officials were confident that they could get 650,000 people out of our area within 3 hours. Does that sound realistic to you? Here's a map. This is the Virginia Survival Plan. And again, this was adopted by the Arlington County Board. And these lines up here, Arlington, Alexandria, these are in the critical zone. Within 10 miles, no chance. Beyond that, you should evacuate. The idea was that up to 650,000 people could evacuate from here, fan out to the far suburbs, to 26 other counties that were considered to be less of a target for whatever reason. And when you have an evacuation plan, government basically breaks that down to two categories. You have an evacuation area, people are fleeing, and you have a reception area. People are fleeing to the reception area. The outer suburbs were almost exclusively reception areas for everyone getting out of DC. DC was almost exclusively an evacuation area. Arlington was about half and half. It's not advancing for some reason. I'm going to put up the test pattern again because we have technical.
There you go.
Okay. So how do you get people out? So we did a whole series of studies before the Northern Virginia regional meeting released an evacuation plan for Arlington areas on using the local roads to get out. And there are a lot of studies that went into it. You look at the list, it's really quite impressive. The studies they used for traffic flow in an evacuation were kind of a roster of all the best stadiums and concert halls and events of that era. And they looked at how long it took to get out of that stadium to the car and then onto a major artery out of Washington area. And there were 7 roads in Northern Virginia considered a part of the critical evacuation route. So when you're talking about Arlington County, we can't do better than our own airport drive-in. And that's what we're looking at here. See on the bottom of the screen, you see National Airport, the parking lot. This building has long since been torn down. This was a federal temporary building, only there during World War II. The railroad yards, Crystal City. Here is the Arlington Airport drive-in. It was at the corner of Jefferson Davis Highway and South 20th Street. And it held 650 cars. And so a study that was done of the airport, of the drive-in, was used to help inform the evacuation plan for DC, because it measured how many cars could come and go from this drive-in lot every 5 minutes, and the results are down here. And they would spill out onto Route 1. Anyone here ever seen a movie at the airport drive-in? Okay. It's just before my time. They were there from 1947 or 8 to 1963. And I say that's wholly unrecognizable now, of course. This building, I say, is no longer here, but you will see this shape again later on. Almost all of the federal temporary buildings that were built during the 2 world wars have this shape. They had most of the same contractors, design, materials. They were roughly an irregular cone. They had this long spine and these wings that would come out with parking in between. And we see this shape over and over again for federal buildings. And it was at National because National was a major hub for moving servicemen in and out of the U.S. So here's Arlington plans. This is the tactical evacuation map for Arlington. This photo is the Shirley Highway in the fall of 1960. The Shirley Highway had been open about 7 years at that point, and obviously quite popular. It's already jammed up. And you look at these arrows. The thinking was that people would come from these neighborhoods to get to one of the major arteries. Anything on this side of Route 50 would come here to the Shirley Highway, it was thought. That was where they're supposed to go. But study after study since then has shown that people don't follow these routes, that an evacuation looks almost exactly like a regular commuting route. Because people, when they have an emergency, they don't go to where the evacuation point is, they go home instead. They just do it faster. After looking at all the studies, they decided that our local roads, such as 395, could handle 1,000 cars per hour per lane. So we look at something like at the 395, and let's say this telephone pole here, or whatever kind of pole it is, was the starting point. 3 lanes, 3,000 cars would pass that point every hour, they said. So if you look at trying to get out of DC after the fireworks or leaving FedEx Field or anything like that, can we move 1,000 cars per lane per hour? And add on top of that the panic of an enemy attack? I don't know. These buildings, by the way, they're still standing. This is I think this is coming north. It's just it's near just north of Shirlington. And I say this was a adopted. This was in place for several years. This is also a huge wall map. I just happened to pick out the section that showed the Pentagon. So for Arlington, here's how we did it. And again, all these were tested later in Skyshield. I know we're spending a lot of time on this, but this is the fun art of Arlington trivia. Our control center was at the Arlington Hospital Center, which is, of course, still there, at 1800 North Edison, not too far from the intersection of Lee Highway. And we had 47 points in Arlington to check the traffic, to remind drivers where to go. And this is a typical photo near the Fairfax County garage of the type of volunteers that would direct traffic. And of course, that begins with the Girl Scout. And you have the police, the Red Cross, and civil defense workers. And here they are meeting up and checking in. Arlington Hospital Center was selected because it was one of the two anchor hospitals that would be considered most critical in a nuclear attack. Our own Arlington Hospital, and then one in Northeast Washington called Casualty Hospital, a few blocks behind the Capitol. And that is still there, it just has a different name. These happened every year leading up to Skyshield, so often that people started to say, oh, just another drill, who cares? And so this one in 1959, all the suburbs reported in to the federal poll taker, essentially said, no one cared. The protocol when the siren was off was that cars were supposed to pull off the road and get to the curb to allow emergency vehicles to go by. In Montgomery County, they said only 1 in 50 cars did that. If you're walking on the sidewalk in downtown DC, you're supposed to go to the nearest shelter. And DC officials said no, people just kept on walking. They ignored it. And so people had drill fatigue. And that is part of the reason why when the real big exercises, Skyshield started happening in the 60s, people said, it's just another exercise, who cares? People had no idea of the scale of what was taking place. So let's start getting into the exercise. Finally, in comes this guy here, Najib Halabi, and he was the second administrator of the brand new agency, the FAA. At the time, it was the Federal Aviation Agency, and later on, that changed to administration, became one arm of the Department of Transportation. But at that time, it was a standalone agency. He was brought into town. I think what's most interesting about this is that he was introduced to Washington on the society page. It really speaks to the glamour, the prestige of aviation in 1960. Plus, he was relatively young, 45, and he was right in terms of people who were leaders in this field. He was right out of central casting. I mean, he was a test pilot who had served in the Army, Air Force, and the Navy, flown almost everything in the fleet of the military and in the airlines. And he is recognized as the first person to fly a jet aircraft across the continental US. So he had quite a resume. And he had a beautiful wife. They came to Washington from Dallas. The family heritage is from Syria. Family is wealthy. They ran a rug and antique business at Neiman Marcus department store. And so when he came to Washington, he took antiques and fancy rugs and grabbed one of the nicest offices in Washington at the time, which was on New York Avenue, the building since turned down, a block from the White House, and put in artwork and this massive desk, an antique desk. And he wanted to be close to John F. Kennedy, who appointed him to the job. I interviewed him in 2000, end of 2000, I guess. It was only a couple of years before he passed away. He confirmed to me what I had heard from other FAA people, that his daughter, Lisa Halabi, would always come to the office with him and play underneath this desk. So why is the name Lisa Halabi famous now? Anyone? What was that? Lisa Hallaby went to school. She was just a toddler during Skyshield. She went to school at the National Cathedral School, and later she became part of the first co-ed class at Princeton. Hallaby, who went by the nickname of Jeeb, was asked by the King Hussein of Jordan to come start a training academy in the Middle East for airline pilots. He went to the Middle East, took Lisa, and eventually she married King Hussein and became Queen Noor of Jordan. So that's Jeeb's daughter. Later on, Jeeb became the chairman of Pan Am. So here he is at Dulles Airport, and I threw this in to show that Skyshield did not affect Dulles Airport at all because it didn't open until November of '62. But here he is next to JFK. This is the opening ceremonies for Dulles Airport in November of '62. Here is JFK getting a tour of the People Movers. He's probably mumbling, people are going to grow to hate these things. Does anyone like the People Movers at Dulles Airport? No, I see one not. Okay. Okay, so where did they set up office space? Here at FAA headquarters, which is the former Civil Aeronautics Administration, these were all temporary buildings left over from the wartime. These were built in World War I, everything else in World War II, and a ceremony to turn the old Civil Aeronautics Administration into the new FAA. And this is right here, only a few hundred feet from the Washington Monument. So here's what it looked like before then. This is a World War II era map. All these temporary buildings on every side of the reflecting pool, bumping up against the monument. These are women's dormitories. Over here, this is the Arlington Farms. Have you had a talk on that before? That was a dorm with 7,000 beds for women workers during World War II. Okay. Here they are. There was so much traffic for these federal office buildings at the time that they built for a while covered bridges across the reflecting pool, so you could walk inside between the buildings. So here, they were still here as of '63. This is the March on Washington. With all the temporary buildings, all of this is now either open space or statues. So this period of Skyshield, it wasn't due to Skyshield, but that was kind of a turning point in the office space around Washington. Since FAA didn't have its own office, Jeeb Hallaby took the fancy one on New York Avenue. His senior staff set up out of their houses in Arlington. His deputy administrator, right on North Stafford Street, is assisted for appraisal over on an apartment building in Pentagon City. And that was their official address on federal government records. Alan Dean was the number 2 man at FAA. His house is still there. He was kind of infamous in Arlington. He used to be on the county board in the early 50s, but he was challenged in a lawsuit because he had county board seat at the same time he was working for a federal agency. He lost the case and they had to have a special election to remove him. Jeeb said, let's make Skyshield a way to test something he'd always wanted to try, the Federal Aviation Service. And that was a plan to turn everyone in the FAA instantly from a civil servant into a military conscript. So in case of war, you'd lose your civil service status and you report to the commander, Jeeb Hallaby, and you'd become subject to the code of military justice. Boys didn't like it because it would ruin their pensions. All right, finally, Skyshield. So it came time for a Skyshield, and we had these by the thousands, virtually every air base in the US. They set up altitude reservations, which they are done entirely by computer, of course. They'd list when they should take off, how they should climb, exactly where, and all of this was conducted under what's called Zulu time, which is Greenwich Mean. So when you see things like this, 1744 Z, that's Greenwich Mean Time. That's 5 hours ahead of East Coast. And this is typical. The idea was that our friendly aircraft would fly 6,000 flights out of the US into Canada or over the ocean, circle around, and then come in to pretend that they were a Soviet attack. The point was to test all of our systems, whether the radar caught them, and at the same time, the cities would test their civil defense plans that we've just been explaining. And this happened 3 times. So for the first, for at least 3 months before, they began warning. All the major papers, they warned about the coming outage, added extra buses between here and Baltimore. The railroads put on extra cars because no airlines would be running. All the Air Force bases warned the local people that be hearing sonic booms because almost all the fighters that were scrambled out of Andrews and elsewhere went supersonic to intercept the enemy. They didn't get to people, and all the switchboards were just flooded because people reported an attack, sonic booms all over in places they had never seen aircraft before. The pilots reminded even small aircraft that nothing in the US and Canada would be flying. Here it is, calling it the greatest suspension of air traffic in history. The airline said, what a great idea. We're going to be grounded. Let's use that to not only catch up on our training and our maintenance, but to invite the public in to see our airplanes. Because in 1960, people loved airplanes. There was a fascination with it. And so that's what they did. Including at National Airport, though not as big as the other ones. Here it is at the time. There's our drive-in. National Airport was a destination in itself in that era, not only for watching the airplanes, but because its restaurant was quite well known. It had white tablecloth service. They had live music, and people would come into town just to go to that restaurant who didn't have a flight. In that year, Washington National Airport was the 6th busiest airport in the world. Now it's in the 130s ranking. This is staged, but it's typical of the excitement at the time. The jets were supposed to start flying the next year international. This is from New Year's News report. Unheard of to coast in 4.5 hours. Didn't happen because the feds wanted to promote Dulles Airport instead, and Baltimore Airport, which was called Friendship instead. So National was not allowed to have jet flights for the first few years that jets were operating. So here's Skyshield itself. Everything grounded at National Airport. This is an actual frame. The clip is just a cleaning staff there and utterly deserted during the height of the evening rush hour. The tower, all the civilians had to evacuate that, and NORAD sent in its own sergeants to control all the traffic out of National Airport. These are actual flights taking place at Andrews Air Force Base. I say in total there were 6,000 practice flights that took off. We weren't alone. This is a report from Europe. There were 7 countries in total involved, or allies. This is a French report of things going on in Great Britain. They saw something that 70 fictitious bombs, it said, in Europe and Great Britain. And they would get simulated reports of an atomic attack. They'd hit the bunker and they'd plot which way the radiation was going on how to evacuate the people. And they'd direct people to the fallout shelters in Great Britain. And the civilian defense people would go into their bunkers like you see here. It was a great way to spend the weekend playing poker, I'm told. I've seen these and it's an awful place. And Arlington didn't want to miss out on that action. All our local hospitals on Arlington on 16th Street and on Capitol Hill took place in mass casualty exercises during the Skyshields. This is one of them. And we have this guy here. He's one of the teenagers, many who were hired. His name is John Unmack, and he still lives in Arlington. I haven't managed to reach him, but here he is playing a dead victim. He's in the morgue at the hospital. And here's another one, another Arlington resident playing a casualty brought to Arlington Hospital. And they wanted that to be realistic, so they covered them in what's called moulage, which is actual leftover blood plasma that expired and real looking wounds. And some of them were given small pellets of radioactive material to hold to be measured with a Geiger counter at the hospital. During the exercise, the Soviet Union went on Radio Moscow and said, the US holding these exercises proves that it's futile to negotiate. It means they're getting ready for an attack and we're not going to go to the negotiating table anymore. They said on their broadcast, they said the shadow of atomic death looms over the present generation. Example, how is this reported in the Post, 3,000 plane battle? And they ran front page stories of the tower just being taken over by the military. NORAD said the exercise was 100%, almost 100% effective. Said 99 is what the reporter should say. We don't know, at the time, no one knew better. Only the top staff at NORAD knew any better, and FAA. Reporters were literally threatened not to do anything, any other kind of viewpoint. They were kept out of all the test facilities, not allowed to observe anything. The results were kept classified for 36 years. Meanwhile, the other reporting shows that the aircraft tours were very popular at Idlewild, and meanwhile, some were very happy there were no aircraft flying for the weekend. People allowing I gotta watch my time. I gotta wrap up soon. Unfortunately, a B-52 bomber was lost officially without a trace. The families were informed of most of the search. One of them included this gunner, Helmut Christ. They retraced the route, the cells. The B-52s were flying in groups of 3, 2 bombers plus a refueling tanker. They were called cells, and it was 265,000-pound aircraft, enormous. Officially, no word. They were operating in radio silence to simulate an actual enemy attack. And so, if they got into trouble, they didn't get on the radio. It was prohibited for the pilots. The Coast Guard mounted what was then the largest search ever done. 80 ships. It was run out of their headquarters in Lower Manhattan. They've retraced the path from North Carolina up to Newfoundland, refueling down here to near the Bermuda Triangle. And these airplanes were supposed to turn and come in and bomb Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. But right here, approximately, is where they think it went down. It's this Coast Guard headquarters, and I went there to see, these things are long gone. They used to have pneumatic tubes to get all the messages around Lower Manhattan. On October 15th, the airmen were just declared missing and presumed to have perished from fuel exhaustion. Means they ran out of fuel, but they have no idea. And the families were told nothing else. Only about 3 days after that, an East German ship, a communist trawler, or the Martin Anderson, reported to the Coast Guard that they found a raft, a 20-man raft, and they said it had the letters SJUFB on it. The aircraft had come from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, that's SJAFB. So we don't know. Could it have been a mistake? The A and U were quite similar in Morse code. The historian at the Air Force told me that B-52 would not have been carrying a raft of that size in that era. That's the official word. But all the markings on it were otherwise absolutely correct. There's no record that the Coast Guard ever followed up on the report, and the families were never told. I've since told them myself. Air Force kept the results of the exercise top secret for 36 years.
In time of war, the government and the press have customarily joined in an effort based largely on self-discipline to prevent unauthorized disclosures to the enemy. I refer first to the need for far greater public information and second, to the need for far greater official secrecy. In times of clear and present danger, the courts have held that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. Nevertheless, every democracy recognizes the necessary restraints of national security, and the question remains whether those restraints need to be more strictly observed if we are to oppose this kind of attack as well as outright invasion.
So newsmen were told they could only report 99% effective. Results kept classified. They were literally threatened. That speech was to the American Newspaper Publishers Association. Kennedy was upset about his treatment after the Bay of Pigs invasion didn't go well. And publicly, he said that his administration was fully transparent and would release everything. And he advised people not to censor anything. But behind the scenes, the reporters were investigated through the IRS. Radio stations are reported otherwise, were examined by the FCC and lost their license for trumped up reasons, including financial filings, if they went out of the approved message. Shortly later, the British press leaked that 2 of their aircraft out of Bermuda had actually very easily come in past the US radar. So one of our top allies leaked the results, and they did that for the classic reason, follow the money. There are war hawks in the British government who wanted to use the Vulcan as a first strike bomber against the Soviet Union rather than as a deterrence bomber. And so they wanted to prove that the Vulcan very easily got past the defenses of the US and could be used with a very expensive program to become a first attack bomber, first strike bomber. Skyshield 3, we took several hundred of these trainers, T-33s, to simulate what would happen if they were flying at the time the Soviet attack came, almost like in 2001 eventually happened. So they put them all over the US and Canada, gave the alert signal, and timed how and where they were landed. And they did fairly well, but it was a controlled test. Everyone knew it was coming. In 2001, when it actually happened, that plan had long been put away. They stopped practicing it entirely by around 1985. This is at Halifax, shows 40 aircraft parked on the runway. A smaller town is happening in Gander, Newfoundland as well. 7,000 people were stranded there, and people opened their houses and stayed with them, and the whole community pitched in to take the airliners. 2001, the actual attack, everyone reported we had the first groundings ever. And I said, no, we've actually done it 3 times before, and we practiced it for more than 20 years. So a couple of quick flashbacks, and I'm going to wrap up. This is National Airport during Skyshield, and the military photographers said, how do we show that nothing at the airport is moving? Well, I know, we'll take this guy, it's Virginia, and we'll put a thistle in his mouth. Here he is sitting in the general aviation area. And here are airplanes sitting empty during Skyshield at National Airport on their busiest time of the day. 2001, these are my photos that afternoon of the attacks. I went to National Airport to see how they physically shut down the airport. There's one police car looking at me kind of suspiciously. That's understandable. All the gates were locked, and in front of them they had the baggage carts lined up and a line of wheelchairs chained together to block some of the doors. Vehicles parked across some of the roadways to prevent access. The taxi stand completely open. And we found out recently, while I was there on September 11th, on the other side of these buildings, the airport historian was walking on the runway taking photos to record it for history. I had no idea till That Wednesday, the 13th, I went over to the Pentagon and I joined the group. There were people reporting from what used to be the Citgo gas station. And this is my photo, and the Pentagon was still burning. It would continue burning in small pools for another 2 days after that. And they were bringing in emergency crews. They just started to bring in the rigging crews to dismantle the building to find out more wreckage, and hopefully anyone has survived. Commander of NORAD thanked FAA and the airlines, saying that it was not a big deal. They got a lot of training value. The airlines said, well, it was great for Skyshield, was great PR for us. People loved touring the airplanes, but come to think of it, this was a federal exercise, and as long as you're in the mood to admit we were inconvenienced, give us some concessions. So 1961 had been headed to be one of the worst losses of profit in airline history. Skyshield came along, and they said, well, it's all due to Skyshield. Identical in 2001. 2001 was going to be then the newest, largest loss of revenue in airline history. The attacks came, and they said, all of our loss of revenue was due to these attacks. Pay up. And that's what happened. Skyshield, after that, we began running to the long struggle with communism, and today long war is so pervasive it's actually part of its own dictionary entry. Sorry, I went a couple minutes over. If you have follow-up questions, we might be able to take a couple now. Thank you for patience bearing with me. And you can also reach me by email, operationskyshield@yahoo.com. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Apart from the cost to the airlines and the passengers, did you determine what the cost to the federal government was of operating all of these aircraft to do this for 6,000 hours or whatever it is as part of this exercise? What was the cost of that exercise? That's the question for the audience.
The question is, was the cost of Skyshield tracked? And yes, it was tracked quite closely. The airlines submitted their own reports. The federal government calculated the man hours and the fuel and the flight times, and they had exact figures. I don't know them off the top of my head. I can send a follow-up, get it to Annette or something to post. The airlines said on net it was a benefit. They used the stoppage to do training. Some actually held vacations during that time. They did maintenance. People loved going to the Idlewild Airport and tasting airline food. In 1960, only a small part of the population had actually been on an airline. It was almost exclusively for businessmen, no families, and wealthy people. But yeah, they tracked it very closely, and airlines later claimed that they were at a loss, but they were not at all.
Marty, do you have any questions?
Yeah, Roger, we have two questions. I think they're quick answers. One is, if you were in a fallout shelter during a nuclear attack, how long did the government say to stay there until radiation dissipated?
The minimum guideline at the time was 3 calendar days. They recommended to be provided for at least a week. And the community shelters were ideally set up for 2 weeks, but for home shelters, they said 3 days, and that should include such things as a gallon of water for each person per day and a certain amount of food. And all these, and those are on the food side, but the most important in all of these guidelines was the shelter was first. In any emergency situation, always find shelter before you worry about food and water.
Okay, and then one that really relates to the very beginning, or the premise that you had in this presentation. To your knowledge, has anyone corrected the mistaken recent headline that declared in 2001 that was the first time civilian planes were grounded?
No, and for years and years, I went through the exercise. I'd see it, you see reports grounded for the first time in history, historic, and I said no, and I'd submit the corrected information. And essentially I'd hear, well, we like our story better. Thank you, Roger. I should point out, In sum, the results of Skyshield were released in not until 1996 or 97. More than half of the bombers, even friendlies, were completely undetected. Of those, almost half went on to actually be over their target cities. They calculated that if it was an actual attack by the Soviets, that we would have intercepted less than 25% of the enemy bombers. And so you can see why we had an incentive to keep that quiet. Yes, sir.
In declassified reports, did they say the British bombers when they did make it through?
They did. British Vulcan bombers flew very simple maneuvers, low over the ocean to evade the radar, and they just sailed right in.
Any other questions from the in-house audience? Marty?
No, we have no other questions. I think
Okay.
we're good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Okay, and then I'll end the Zoom portion of this.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Wow, that was sobering. Yeah. That was so sobering and disturbing.
Thank you all.
No.